Good morning, everyone. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. Every week, I host First Draft, where I talk with journalists about their important work and the stories behind them. Lincoln Square just celebrated our first anniversary with all of you. We know that pro-democracy journalism is more important than ever, and we're honored to be part of the growing independent media landscape. That's why we're hosting this special on the future of independent media with some of the most interesting writers, radio hosts, and media critics we know. I wanted to explore the landscape of independent journalism from blogs that started it all in the early 2000s to progressive media that gives voice to perspectives that have long been ignored in mainstream media, to new outlets that are starting on Substack and other platforms. And of course, we cannot ignore the state of corporate media during Donald Trump's second term. I wanted to speak with veteran journalists about the mistakes that outlets are still making in covering Donald Trump. And I also wanted to talk with them about what journalists are getting right. At a time when all of us need high quality information and analysis about politics, policy, and world affairs, this is an absolutely vital conversation for us to have. I know I learned a lot in speaking with these writers, and I think you will too. Our panel features Jerusalem Demsas, a former staff writer at The Atlantic who founded The Argument on Substack, Michelangelo Signorile, a longtime host on SiriusXM Progress, and Heather Digby Parton, a Salon contributor who founded one of the most read political blogs, Digby's Hullabaloo. But first up is Mark Jacob. He's a former Chicago Tribune editor who writes the Stop the Press's newsletter on Substack. We discuss the state of corporate media, the good, the bad, and the ugly during this second Trump administration. Mark Jacob is an acclaimed author and journalist whose work explores the intersections of sports, history, and culture. He's a former Chicago Tribune Metro editor, and he currently writes media criticism columns for Courier Newsroom and the Stop the Press's Substack. Mark, thank you for talking with us today.
Thanks for the invitation.
Well, you have a really fascinating piece up about how the Trump administration is kind of flailing under the pressure of the Iran war and the fact that they cannot control the coverage of this war. We saw that Brendan Carr, the chair of the Federal Communications Commission, is going so far as to try and threaten to yank broadcast licenses if news outlets don't effectively do their bidding as far as coverage of this war goes and become propaganda mouthpieces. Mark, you've been part of the media, you've covered many different politicians over the years. Have you seen this kind of extreme reaction to trying to control coverage from any other administration or any other politician?
Well, one thing that should be noted is that, I was deeply involved in coverage of the Iraq War when I was at the Chicago Tribune. I was editing those stories every night. And to a large extent, the news media went along with what the Bush administration was doing. I mean, the Bush administration didn't have to be furious about the news coverage because the news coverage was largely compliant. And part of that was maybe a little bit more kind of gullibility on the part of the news media then. I mean, the idea that they won't lie to us about weapons of mass destruction, and so there was that gullibility, but also the Bush administration sold the war. I mean, over a period of months, they didn't do what the Trump people did, which is just say, hey, we feel like going to war, so we're going to go to war. We're not going to talk to Congress. We're not going to talk to the American people. We're just going to do it. And obviously, when you do that, and the war, it was polling terribly even before that. When they started beating the war drums, the American people clearly aren't in favor of it. And so I think that set up the news media to be skeptical of it. And frankly, I've been very disappointed with media coverage overall, major media coverage over the last decade. It's been really normalizing Trump and trying to kind of paper over really embarrassing things that he's done, and it just frankly his mentally unhinged behavior. And so I've been sharply critical of the news media, but in this case, Trump set it up himself for the news media to be very skeptical. I mean, by not selling the war and just going in and taking, in a really reckless way. And so I guess I must say that I've been very encouraged by the news coverage so far. And it's been a departure for me to not be complaining about terrible news coverage, because I think we're getting a lot of good news coverage on things, the girls' school airstrike, for example, in Iran. You had Trump outrageously try to suggest that the Iranians blew up their own schoolgirls, but the news media wasn't buying it. I mean, nobody's buying it, and it was just gratifying to see the news media, look at video and look at other, hard evidence to try to, ferret out what exactly happened there, and it all points to the U.S.
We've seen that the news media has not been as critical, to your point with your piece on the media giving Trump a pass largely on his mental and physical health issues.
Right.
Also, with not asking him a lot of questions about the Epstein scandal, even though his name appears at least hundreds of thousands of times in the documents that have been released. Why do you think the media has taken a more critical eye to the war? I'm wondering if perhaps one of the turning points was what we saw from his Department of Homeland Security in Minneapolis, where they were telling us not to believe our lying eyes, not to believe the video of the killing of 2 U.S. citizens that really, took a whack at their credibility.
Right. Well, I mean, one of the things I've really criticized the media for doing is blowing up Trump's lies over and over and over again. But then when he issues a new lie, pretending that he just might be telling the truth this one time, this idea that this lack of a learning curve by the mainstream media, where, we know he's a liar and that he lies all the time, especially about important things, but even about crazy stuff. Like the other day, he claimed that he predicted 9/11. Well, he didn't. And that's been debunked. There's a lot of stuff like that. I mean, he just goes to crazy town all the time. So I just feel like there's been a lack of skepticism. But here, you're right. I do think you're right. I think Minneapolis did really change some hearts and minds in the news media, where they recognized that it was a Trump regime policy to systematically lie about things like that. I mean, that's their policy. They lie immediately. The Homeland Security, you can just count on lying when something bad happens with them and the American public.
You've been very critical of the mainstream media for normalizing Trump and his lies, and for embracing both sides reporting, where the Trump administration, Trump as a candidate would lie, they would present the facts, but you figure it out yourself. Even though the role of the media, as we know, should be to present facts and truth.
Right.
How much responsibility do you feel that the media has for the fact that Trump has been able to be not just elected once, but twice, and in spite of telling thousands upon thousands of demonstrably, false things?
Right. I think a great responsibility. I mean, there are two different things. You've got the propaganda media like Fox News, who they feel it's their job to help Trump lie. But then you have mainstream media, the New York Times, the networks, and what they've done is just what I said. They've done the whole. He lied to us, 3,000 times in the last few months, but we're going to pretend this time he might be telling the truth. And so, I've always said that you have to really be skeptical of headlines that start out "Trump says," because what they do a lot of times is just say what Trump says and just leave it at that in the headline, which is what most people read is the headline. And so he gets his message across, even though if they framed it right, if they said, in effect, this guy who's lied to us about the war, a bunch of times just said something about the war, if they framed it in that way, that this is a person who is not trustworthy, then they would be doing much more of a service. And not, I'm not saying a service to the Democrats or a service to the resistance. I'm talking about a service to the truth. So I think that and that's their job. I mean, they're supposed to be, the news media is supposed to be in the truth business and the facts business. And so when they amplify things that are false that he says and act like that's just, normal and that's what presidents do, they're not serving the people. Susan, one of the things there are two different things. There's one when Trump lies about, about the policies and lies about, the horrible things he's doing. But there's another thing about when the news media tolerate him being mentally unstable and act like that's normal, or what they do, even if let's think about this. This guy, the last No King's March, this guy posted a video of him flying an airplane and dropping excrement on protesters. I mean, that's outrageously crazy. That's insane behavior. Yet the New York Times wouldn't even call it excrement. They didn't call it shit. They called it brown liquid. They were that scared of Trump that they had to call it brown liquid. And they didn't even say that he dropped anything on protesters in the main headline. They just said he flew an airplane. So there was this kind of timidity with the Trump administration that, in effect, some people call it Sane-Washing, but they basically underplayed just how insane he was. This guy also, let's remember when Rob Reiner was murdered, Trump posted that it was Rob Reiner's fault that he was murdered. That he was murdered because he made people angry. And I mean, that is just plain unhinged behavior. No person in public life, not to even mention a president, should be tolerated doing that kind of thing. Yet it became this. It was this one-day story. It was one-off, and it just rolled down the river. And then there was something new to talk about. This is what the news media is not doing right. They need to write what I call umbrella stories, which is when you take everything, all the crazy stuff, and you put it right under the umbrella, and you write a sweeping story that explains what the overall picture is based on all these data points. And that way you can write a really clear headline: Trump showing signs of mental instability. I mean, not that they would ever do that because they're afraid to, unfortunately, but write a really direct headline that is a sweeping picture of what's going on, and then just lay out all the data points. Instead, if you write these little one-offs about all the crazy little things he does, it just kind of fades into the background too fast.
Right. We've seen many major media companies acquiesce to Trump, like ABC and CBS, settling these multi-million-dollar lawsuits, and then CBS later remaking its news operation to MAGAfy it under Barry Weiss. We've also seen several prominent journalists who have left legacy outlets or they've been fired, like Jim Acosta, Terry Moran, Anderson Cooper just left 60 Minutes. And then Trump did a big victory lap over the weekend about how he has remade the media. What did you think when you saw that post from him on social media?
I thought that he just was stating what has been obvious to all of us of what he's been trying to do, which is trying to conquer the news media and turn it into a propaganda outlet. It's so interesting. I thought it was really interesting that he was like taking credit for like the CBS multi-million-dollar lawsuit settlement and things like that, because that really just confirmed what people have been saying, which is that CBS acquiescing to them and him in that moment hurt all of us. It hurt the entire news industry and anyone who cares about the news industry. I mean, and when he like he listed Terry Moran, I believe he listed Acosta. He's taking all these scalps and he's putting, he's displaying them, and which means that whenever a mainstream outlet acquiesces to him, they are making it harder for every other mainstream outlet to be independent and truth-based. And he knows that. And and that and the Brendan Carr stuff is just outrageous. Brendan Carr, just flat out saying that, if you don't cheerlead for the war, we're going to go after your broadcast licenses. I mean, that's not something that happens in a democracy. That's something that happens in a dictatorship. I mean, that is outrageous behavior that no one should tolerate. I mean, honestly, Susan, Trump ought to be out of office immediately. He should be immediately impeached, kicked out of office, and for all of this horrible, crazy behavior. And the more the news media normalize this and act like, well, this is just the way presidents act, the more he's going to act crazy and do really damaging things. The more he's going to do airstrikes on girls' schools and steal oil from Venezuela and threaten to take over Cuba. I mean, all this behavior that never would have been tolerated in the past. And when the news media just say, well, this is the kind of things that presidents do. Well, it's kind of things that a autocratic person does, that a king does, not a kind of person that should be running a democracy. And it's really up to us and the news media to not tolerate this, to not act like, well, this is just the way things are. No, it's not. This is the way things should never be, and we got to stop it now.
We have been seeing a rise of independent media especially during the second Trump term, as people are looking for fact-based news. And I think a lot of viewers and readers are kind of fed up with this timidity from the mainstream media. We've seen some of those, scalps on Trump's chart. They've struck out alone on Substack or other platforms like Jim Acosta and Terry Moran. What do you see as the bright lights of independent journalism, and what are some of the limits as well?
Well, I think ProPublica is great. And, ProPublica, exposed the corruption in the Supreme Court when the New York Times and the Washington Post were covering it for decades and never did. So I really like them. I think The Guardian is excellent. And it's a kind of a shameful thing for the American media that a British-based news outlet is doing better job of covering American politics than the Americans are. I think The New Republic is excellent. And Greg Sargent, who does their stuff, is just super good and really on point.
And he left the Washington Post,
right.
One of many journalists at this point.
Right. Aaron Rupar, who is very active on social media and does a lot of news clips that show, all the crazy things that are said on TV and in the press conferences.
That often don't make it into the New York Times coverage or NBC's coverage.
Right. In my Stop the Press's newsletter, I will often link to his stuff because nobody in the, in the supposedly legitimate media have done that. I do think it's really a healthy sign that there are so many people doing newsletters or doing podcasts on YouTube, this and that. I mean, anything that kind of breaks the stranglehold of the big corporate media is a good thing. And so that's very encouraging. Now, the downside, is that their audiences often aren't huge. These mainstream outlets still have just more eyeballs on them. And so they have more of an impact, which is why Trump, has been trying to extort them and shake them down for protection money. And just make them behave, I mean, when you saw Hegseth say in a press conference that he's can't wait for the Ellisons to take over CNN. I mean,
the way they've taken over CBS News.
Right. I mean, what was that? That was him saying that we are autocrats and we want the government to take over control of news media. And we therefore they will lie to the American public about what's happening in this war. And I mean, they're not hiding it. They really are not hiding it. They want the news media to be compliant and to say exactly what they want it to say, and they want the American people to not understand what's going on.
Mark, thank you for talking with us. It's always such a pleasure, and I hope you'll come back to Lincoln Square soon.
Would love to.
Next up is Jerusalem Demsas. We talked about the challenges and opportunities in starting new independent publications over the last year. Jerusalem Demsas is an award-winning journalist and founder of The Argument. She is known for her analysis of the U.S. housing crisis and institutional failures, and she joins us today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Susan.
Great. Well, I know we talked last year, right after you launched The Argument, and you feature a lot of very well-known journalists like Matt Iglesias, Derek Thompson, yourself. Talk to us about what was the reasoning behind launching a new publication, and tell us how it's been going for these months.
Yeah, I mean, it's been going great. I mean, I think it's really the time for independent media right now. So many different platforms have made it easier to start up your own company and really try to reach readers who have niche interests. I mean, it used to be the case that, the startup costs for a new magazine or a new newspaper at the level that we're trying to reach at, where we have these contributors who have their own platforms. I mean, you would really need to build up your own website infrastructure. You'd have to build up your own payments infrastructure. It was a huge barrier to entry for new entrants like ourselves and like Lincoln Square, of course, and other media enterprises that have popped up in the past decade. And it's really amazing that many people can do this now at a much lower cost. And I think it's been going really well because right now there's a real appetite for people who are looking for a more combative and full-throated defense of liberalism. We have this sort of sense of liberalism as kind of milk toast between two poles, centrist kind of quality. And in reality, liberalism is the ideology that brought us workers' rights, that brought us civil rights, that brought us feminism, that brought us economic prosperity that has really pulled billions of people out of poverty. And I think it's time that liberals started acting like it.
One thing that I've noticed, especially as the years go on, is that a lot fewer mainstream outlets cover policy in depth, whether that's housing, which is your area of expertise, healthcare, foreign affairs, in part because those articles may not get as many eyeballs as celebrity news or, stories on the latest polling for political junkies. So I'm wondering, have you found that is a real area of opportunity for independent journalists to develop these more niche publications that might be focused on areas of policy where you're not dependent on a mass audience?
I totally agree. I mean, I think that there are niche audiences out there who really don't want just the surface level. Oh, there's a federal housing bill passed. Really want the deep behind the scenes. What are the policy mechanics? What should you fight for? What are the real debates going on? And I think there are two things that someplace like The Argument is able to fulfill, but also I hope many more policy focused media ventures startup as well, is really being willing to trust that the audience is not just looking for the surface level, but also still being committed to the idea that you're supposed to entertain and engage people in your writing. And the way that we do this is that we center what the actual conflicts are. Often you'll read a policy piece of journalism and it's very descriptive, which can be very useful to someone like me who wants to know just what are the facts, what's the pattern of information that gets me to understand what actually happened behind the scenes. But when you're reading something to understand it holistically, you want to understand what the debate is in the context of other things you care about. So it's not just, okay, the Road to Housing Act that's currently being debated in the Senate has X number of Democratic senators and X number of Republican senators in favor. You want to know, what are the hot button issues that are creating tension between home builders and realtors and Democratic senators within the party, and really centering that conflict and explaining it to folks, but also directing them where we think the correct side of it is. That's how we're able to make sure our policy journalism isn't just dry and repetitive.
We've seen just waves of layoffs in legacy media over the last couple decades, and even whole publications and news affiliates closing their doors. Now we have an influx of new publications. They're launched in the last year alone, whether it's us at Lincoln Square or you at The Argument. But we've also seen a number of journalists who have kind of struck out on their own, like Don Lemon and Katie Couric. Talk with us about the opportunities that you've seen in independent journalism and why you think it really has grown so much.
Yeah, I mean, I think in part is what I said earlier around the costs of being able to start something up have gone down, and I want to talk a little bit about like the choice between going independent and between starting your own institutional, home. And when I was considering leaving the Atlantic, like some people were really telling me like you should just go start your own Substack newsletter. It'll be so much easier. You can write a few times a week, and you won't have to do all the stuff that comes with building an institution, and you'll make way more money individually, and like all that is definitely true, which is I think why a lot of people are opting into that. But I think that also correctly, people who start institutions recognize that there's a much bigger impact you can have if you build an institution that goes beyond what you yourself can do. In the short run, it definitely limits like how much I can write or how much I can spend on reporting on my own. But in the long run, what you're doing is you're creating a home for the types of voices you want to see in journalism. One big thing that we're doing at the Argument is we are running an annual fellowship program. We have 3 early career writers, some right out of college, others who have been working for many years already in non-journalistic industry, and creating an opportunity for these people to learn how to be a journalist, learn what the mechanics of reporting, researching, also developing their own voice in public, and doing that in an institution that has like a very clear framework. I mean, these are the types of things that institutions can do that individuals on their own like definitely couldn't if you were just like one person, starting your own newsletter. And both those things are great. I'm not denigrating people who want to strike out on their own. I mean, a bunch of our contributors and columnists are actually individuals who get the benefits of, folks like Matthew Iglesias, Derek Thompson, Kyla Scanlon, Joey Politano. These are all people who have independent newsletters or media ventures of their own that are very successful. And also they get the benefits of getting to work with a newsroom where there is an editor, there is a fact checker, there is, a social media team, and those sorts of things. I mean, I think independent media, digital media, that's not these institutional big places, can really provide the best of both worlds to a lot of these independent writers. So if anyone listening is interested in writing for the Argument, you can pitch me.
You come from the world of legacy media, as I do. How do you see the relationship between like mainstream media and independent journalism today?
I mean, media people are an infamously snipey bunch, so I'm sure there's just a lot of there's just a lot of chatter and sniping at each other on Twitter or in I guess Brooklyn bars or whatever. But I do think that like at core it's very positive stuff. Like when I look back at the earlier iteration of digital media, when Vox was launched, when BuzzFeed was big, like these really now these institutions are, I feel like, much more legacy media to most people. They've been around for like a decade or more at some point, and some of them of course are no longer with us, but all of them had a massive impact on institutional media. I think Vox in particular, where I worked for a little over a year, when you look at New York Times analysis pieces, or the New York Times has a piece that goes, I don't know, like truckers explained or whatever, like that is the vestige of the impact that institutional media is feeling from the pressures that digital media, that smaller media pushes. And I think also like newer ideas that maybe might be taboo in some cases or are really on the fringe, ideas where experts are just right now coming to a consensus and that hasn't been transmitted to major institutions yet. Digital media is often the first to break the silence on different things, like whether it's, hey, actually we've been thinking about housing policy all wrong and like everyone's incorrect about this, or it's something more politically difficult to say around what's going on in diversity and hiring at media institutions. Like these are types of things that often it takes a little bit of time for the legacy media to begin entertaining the conversation, and independent media often is like less constrained, less encumbered by the expectations of being the Atlantic or the New York Times or the New Yorker. And so they can just take risks. And I think those risks actually benefit the whole media ecosystem in very symbiotic ways.
And it's interesting, you brought up a couple of the newer media companies like Vox and BuzzFeed, and we've seen Ezra Klein from Vox, and at one point Ben Smith from BuzzFeed went to the New York Times.
Yeah.
Ezra Klein is still there, and so there does seem to be some fluidity within those now legacy publications, but also so much of the independent journalism landscape is made up of veterans as well, kind of bringing that perspective into a new form with those journalistic conventions, with fact checking, which is so vital, but willing to take some risks and do something new, to your point, which I think is really interesting and kind of gives you a broader scope of media to enjoy today. Although maybe for some people it's overwhelming. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard because obviously like competitive pressures can work in multiple directions. Like creators, for instance, are providing a real competitive pressure, particularly I think in entertainment media. And like you see now, if you see the red carpet interviews, they're often entirely done by influencers or creators that are not journalists. They don't pretend to be journalists. They're entertainers, and they're not trying to ask hard-hitting questions. They're trying to entertain, create content.
Right.
And that obviously creates a lot of pressure on existing media because there creates an expectation that now you can get coverage, you can reach broader audiences without subjecting yourself to hard-hitting journalism, without subjecting yourself to an institution that has a fact checker, an institution that's going to like be aware of like the big debates and like come to you with reporting. And I think that that's quite bad in many respects, but there's ways in which it can be good. It can be good because it means that the gatekeepers within institutional media can't decide who is going to get attention and not without some kind of democratizing pressure. And it also can mean that people within institutional media, people who are doing great work, doing investigative journalism and doing hard-hitting, reporting, that those people are less focused on the access side of journalism, because talking directly to the subject of your journalism is like an important thing to do, but it's not like the only thing you should be doing. And it's not even the main thing you should be doing when you're doing reporting. Like when you're reporting on a candidate for office, like yes, you should talk to them and find out what they would say to certain things, but like largely that's not the main thing that you can uncover for people. Often public figures are already saying a lot of the stuff they believe out loud, or they're tweeting it, or they're putting it on Instagram stories or whatever it is. The goal is for you to help demystify things that they're not putting out as public statements already. So I do think that it's, there's some pros and cons here, and I understand feeling overwhelmed about it, but in the end, I think there's lots of ways that independent media can help make things better.
You know as well as I do that most politicians are not big fans of the media, and they have their critiques and their attacks. But President Trump seems to take that to a very different level. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, how do you feel like his approach to the media and his administration's approach to the media has changed during this second term versus what we saw during his first term?
Yeah, I mean, the Atlantic reported on this recently about how everyone has Trump's phone number now. And, Max Tani at Semaphore spent, I guess, a few hours and was able to get Donald Trump's phone number, personal cell phone number. And it's clear that the like legacy media and new media outlets, particularly on the right, have like a direct line to the president in a way that's like, I think it like seems like a positive thing that you can reach the president of the United States and ask him his opinion and get it. The problem is that Trump as an individual, like what he says in one moment is not actually indicative of like what the actual truth is. Like often you catch someone unawares and they tell you something that might indicate to you like, oh, your real belief is Y, not X, right? But with Trump, it's like he will just turn around and say like, oh, just kidding, I don't actually believe that anymore the next day. And so it actually, I think in some ways devalues the importance of like directly hearing from him on various items. You see this in markets as well right now. Markets that would probably react pretty significantly to like random pronouncements from the president about foreign affairs, about the war with Iran, about the state of things with Russia and Ukraine, are often quite muted when he makes like these big claims or provocative press releases or whatever it is, and they're muted because they're like, well, I don't really know if that's real. Like that feels like probably it's not real. And so in some ways I think that like Trump has like kind of broken like a lot of the value of what the presidential pronouncements are supposed to do. Like it used to be the case that you could kind of use the bully pulpit to just kind of push things in a certain direction without having to like do policy. And obviously I think future presidents will still be able to do that because they might have more credibility about about what they're saying being reflective of their internal policies. But I think that that's kind of the situation now with Trump. And I think broadly with the media and reaction to Trump, I mean, when you see in the second term is that they are much more willing to really platform more fringe outlets. Like they still really care what the New York Times says and writes. You can see this clearly both in how the White House, press secretary operates, and also just what they react to on social media, what their communications team, they care a lot how the New York Times frames things. But even in the White House, press room, like you see basically like right-wing creators being given the same billing as like top journalists. And I don't know, like I think that's, I mean, it seems bad to me. It seems like a useless way to spend time for the American people. But at the same time, I'm like, I think that those White House press conferences are largely not that valuable or useful for the American people. Like, what are you really getting out of that? Very rarely do you get some kind of admission that's like new or important to report on. And if the marginal reporter is now doing real reporting rather than just like sitting in the White House correspondence room and like taking notes on what the White House press secretary says, that seems good.
Well, Jerusalem, thank you so much for being here and talking with us. I always enjoy our conversations, and thanks so much.
Yes, I love talking to you, Susan. You have a great outlet at Lincoln Square, and I hope it's the digital media that becomes the legacy media of the future.
That would be fun if we can come back 5-10 years from now, and all of a sudden we're not the new kids on the block anymore.
Exactly.
And we see what came after us. So great. Thank you so much.
Of course. Have a good one.
My third panelist is Michelangelo Signorile. I spoke with him about the state of progressive media and the need to include perspectives that are often ignored by legacy media. I'm so pleased that we have Michelangelo Signorile, a host at SiriusXM Progress and author of the Signorile Report on Substack, here to join us to talk with us about the state of media. Michelangelo, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, as always, for having me on, Susan.
Well, I know that you are a voracious consumer of news, and I'm wondering, in the Trump 2 era, what mainstream media are getting it right and who is getting it really wrong?
I think we've seen all of the media, all of the corporate media, mainstream media, certainly the big outlets, really struggling with how to deal with this administration from the very beginning, which is, it's disappointing, it's angering, and it's also a bit stunning because they had to deal with Trump before and they've never figured out how to do it. I think some have really gotten their footing as we've gone along and sort of found, that way. But it seems like fits and starts. We see them pulling back. We certainly saw early on Trump capitulating in these lawsuits at ABC and of course at CBS as well. That didn't start things out very well. We've seen CNN with very mixed coverage. I mean, look, these news organizations, CNN, the New York Times, others, I mean, they do really good reporting that we all rely on. And they have certainly exposed some big stories and have contacts. And so that's all very good. It's just the inconsistency, the framing of stories, the sort of dropping the ball on certain stories. They'll do a couple of stories on something, for example, Trump's mental state and his physical health, but really his brain, like what is happening. We saw over and over and over again throughout Biden years, just story after story about Biden's mental state and what was happening and people inside and what they were saying. We had a couple of stories like that about Trump. We're seeing it in front of us, the deterioration, even as he's now waging war. I mean, we see him forgetting things. We see him saying he never heard of something. He's claiming a president told him something about supporting going into Iran. There is no living president who did that, right? So, we see all these things and we don't see that focus, that story of what is happening with his mental health. And that's just one example. So they'll, the New York Times did a story early on, and then they just kind of dropped it. We don't see the consistency we need, and that's just something that points to the importance of independent media.
Right. Well, we do see these double standards persist when it comes to Trump. Trump has made several comments where he really has been extremely flippant about the 13 U.S. service members who have died in the Iran war. And if you just contrast that with the utter hysteria in 2014 with the media coverage of Barack Obama doing the infamous coffee cup salute to the Marine as he stepped off of the aircraft. One is a story of outrage from that's drummed up by Republicans. The other is an extremely serious matter involving our commander of chief who is putting our troops in harm's way. Why does this double standard persist in corporate media?
Right. I mean, Trump wore that hat when the first soldiers came for the dignified transfer. Their bodies came over, and it was an insult to them. It was an insult to their families. It was an insult to the American military. And if that were Obama or Biden, the story would have exploded. And it's not that critics didn't point it out. It's not that Democrats didn't point it out. So you can't really say, well, okay, the opposition wasn't focused on it. They do have this double standard, as you pointed out. He's lowered the bar so low. And I think they feel, many of these editors and producers, that, oh, we've already pointed out things like that about him, and it's a waste of our time and resources. And why should we keep doing that? And I think Trump has learned how to sort of get them into that groove of, like, get them used to the bar being very low. And he's been successful at that, and they have gone along with it instead of really focusing on it in a big way. And where were the Republican members of Congress speaking out? Well, there weren't really any, but were they asked? How many reporters really asked the question and brought it up and really pushed the issue? Not many.
Right. You brought up the lawsuits that CBS and ABC News ended up settling with Trump, but not all outlets have bowed down. The New York Times and even the Murdoch-owned Wall Street Journal are fighting back against Trump's lawsuits in court. Why won't more outlets follow that lead?
I think that is a really good question. It's kind of the same as the law firms and the universities, right? That we've seen as well. You have some owners who just capitulate because they're worried about other corporate interests. These are, oftentimes media outlets owned by huge media conglomerates. New York Times is an independently owned newspaper, a family-owned newspaper. It doesn't have these other corporate interests. We could argue about what other corporate connections they have and whatnot, but they're not owned by a larger company. It's not, a Paramount, CBS, now Skydance, or, previously the owners very worried about getting a merger through, right? The same with ABC. So I think you have that, and you have boards wanting to move on and get this pushed off, and worried that it's going to affect their bottom line. And ultimately, it only emboldens Trump. We saw that with the universities. We saw that with what happened with Columbia University. We've seen that with the law firms as well. So it's a lose-lose proposition. They lose credibility. It doesn't really gain them anything. Trump is still calling ABC. I think just yesterday he told an ABC reporter, "You're a rotten reporter, and you're at the worst news organization in history." Of course, they're all the worst in history. It doesn't help them at all, except maybe for future mergers and acquisitions.
I wanted to talk with you a little bit about the state of progressive independent media. We've seen MSNBC change its name and step back a bit from moderate, in terms of hosts and coverage in the Trump 2 era. So, what is the overall landscape right now?
I think it's very interesting. We have a very um, diffuse, very, I think, large alternative media. And, people can um, be worried about what MS Now may do or may not do. Is it enough? Were they doing enough before? Are they really an outlet that's going to push hard? They do have a lot of former Republicans on, and people complain about a lot of things, but they are still doing independent journalism. They are still, at least at night, having independent and very bold commentators speaking out. And what we've seen in terms of all of the other media that has popped up, certainly, um, publications like Lincoln Square and The Bulwark and others that have gone to Substack and have really helped to create larger platforms. We've got, because of social media, I think, this real connection with all of these different platforms. We've got YouTube programs, we've got podcasts, we've got SiriusXM and Progress, right? We've got other radio that is independent. I think it's for some people, they would rather see sort of one big news organization, or at least a couple of big ones, but I don't think it's going to work that way. I think the way it is working now is that we have more outlets than ever before. It's not like when we had a couple of websites, or even further back, alternative weeklies in cities. I mean, we now really have an amazing array of publications, and people might subscribe or follow one or two or three, or some will follow a bunch more. But whatever they're following, I think they're getting a lot of the news and information because we're all connected. All these platforms are connected. We're not only interchanging with one another, literally, right, like we're doing right now, but social media is bringing it all together. So people are seeing what's happening everywhere else. And that means the creators too, the editors, the writers, the reporters are seeing what's happening. I think we all are, I can speak with you about everything that's happening, and we both know what's going on, and it's not like we're in separate bubbles. And I think that's a good thing. I think that that's the way it's working right now. And we've seen these platforms really raise issues to an above the radar place. I mean, we often see now the New York Times or the Washington Post, which is a whole other story, or other papers, um, amplifying what's happening on Substack,
Mm-hmm.
amplifying so many of the writers and the journalists on Substack who are doing great work. We have great independent journalism that's happening. Some people with part of news platforms, but some people on their own platform doing work and doing the journalism. I think about, for example, Roger Solenberger, who
Mm-hmm.
used to be at the Daily Beast and now has his own Substack, and he's the one who really broke the story of the 50 missing pages in the Epstein files. And
About Donald Trump and the
that's
very
right.
serious allegations against him with a minor child.
That's right. And then NPR saw what he did, and they jumped on it. And then the New York Times jumped on it. So I think we're seeing this independent journalism and these alternative outlets, or whatever you want to call them, really impacting that larger media too. And that's a good thing.
As far as right-wing media goes, I feel like they have been years ahead of building that infrastructure of progressives. It's extremely well funded. There are so many outlets. Obviously, you have Fox News, that's kind of the godfather of it all, but you have the Epic Times, the Daily Wire, OWN, on and on. And of course, these outlets are getting questions at White House and Pentagon briefings now. And so their influence, it has skyrocketed with the Trump administration. I wanted to ask you, Michelangelo, why have why has it been so much more of a challenge for progressives to build that kind of infrastructure for their own independent media? And what do you see the future of that being?
I think the big word, the one word answer is money. And, what I just described about what's happening among progressives, that's all organic, right? It's happening because people have just said, we've got to do this, right? So many of us who are journalists and commentators, we've just said, we're not going to shut up. We're going to do our reporting. We're going to do it. And it's organic. And we get whatever funding we can get. We get whatever backers we can find. Some people are just doing it on a shoestring. That is sometimes being held up and lifted up. And that's a great thing, but it's all really organic. What's happening on the right and what has happened on the right for many years is massive amount of money poured into news outlets. And, we don't even have to go back to Fox News and, of course, what Rupert Murdoch created, but even just looking at in the last few years, all of these podcasters, Benny Johnson, all of them have had massive infusions of money from right-wing donors, from MAGA
And foreign
donors.
governments as well.
And yes, that's right. In the case of those who were found to be taking money from Russia. So, I mean, the right has understood, and I'm not saying that that's necessarily this terrible thing. It's anybody can, help to fund a news organization, but they've understood that you need to help to amplify these voices, and that sometimes it's not going to happen organically, or it won't happen in a big enough way, and it's going to take big backing. We haven't had those kind of deep pockets, like George Soros saying, hey, let's fund a media organization, or 10 of them, or let's put a lot of money behind those right now that could use that money to go take it to that extra step. We haven't seen that kind of organizing among liberals, among progressives, the way the right has focused on it.
I spent most of my career in mainstream media, nonprofit media, and there was always such a competition for resources because the layoffs seemed to be just constant. We would see newspapers and even TV affiliates and radio stations shut their doors. And that's just been the media landscape for the last couple of decades. One thing that I have found really interesting in this growing independent media landscape is that even though obviously there is some competition for viewers and for readers, but there's a lot of collaboration, like we're doing right now. There are a lot of people who see that there's something bigger than just the bottom line, but we're fighting for our democracy. We're fighting for our values. And so there is strength in numbers, and there's, a value in us collaborating and working together to get the truth out and to get good information out to people. I'm wondering what your perspective is as somebody who's spent so much time working in the media about this particular moment that we're at.
There's no question that people are collaborating and helping one another. And as I said, the platforms and social media make it easier to connect. And everyone realizes that it not only helps raise all boats in terms of the work we're doing, but also it's vital. We have to do this because of the threat to democracy. People are very committed to making sure they're working together and getting the word out. And I think that we've seen a lot of that exchange and a lot of that interaction and collaboration because people are so worried about what may happen, what may be the next thing that we're going to be under threat of, including media itself, including our voices too. I mean, we've seen the attempts to try to shut down media. So I think people see that as vital, and it has kind of created less of a competition and more of a community. And I really do see it as a community. And even with my program on SiriusXM, I mean, we go everywhere, all across the country and even globally on the apps. And people are living in small towns, rural areas, big cities. it really is a community, the listenership, and they really do connect with us as a community. And then they're bringing up what they just read on this blog or this website or this podcast or what was said on that news outlet. I mean, so they're helping us to exchange all the information too, and it's connecting them. And some of these people are in very rural areas where there's very little media. So I think it's something I think we all feel very proud of, that we're helping to connect people, and those are the people going out to march, and those are the people who are knocking on doors, and that's so important.
Right. And also, it's important because in corporate media, there are a lot of voices that are not always highlighted, and those tend to be women and people of color and people from the LGBTQ plus community. And so I think that that's another area that independent media is really just so vital for.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing voices that have often been shut out of corporate media, or if they are there to sort of toe the establishment line as a member of a minority. We've seen so much of that, where there's a quest to have a diverse newsroom or a diverse, sort of display, if you will, but then everyone is expected to follow certain ground rules that I think immediately kind of silence those people in a way, because the newsroom or the organizations, the news organization's own idea of what journalism is, takes precedent, and sometimes that doesn't gel with making sure that these issues are focused on, that affect people of color, that affect women, that affect LGBTQ people. So this is another thing I think that is very important about all of these spaces and platforms being independent. Everybody can do what they want, and they can then have this exchange with one another, but it's not coming through a filter that is expecting them to sort of keep within a certain format or keep within a certain top-down idea of what the news is.
Absolutely. Michelangelo, thank you for being with us today. It's always wonderful to talk with you.
It's always great to speak with you too, Susan. Thank you for having me.
And my final guest is Heather Digby Parton. I talked with her about how blogging was once in competition with mainstream media and how independent journalism has evolved. Heather Digby Parton is also known in the blogosphere as Digby, and she is a contributing writer to Salon. She's also the winner of the Hillman Prize for Opinion Journalism, and she joins us now. Heather, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
Great. Well, I'm sure that many people are familiar with your work at Digby's Hullabaloo, and you are really on the cutting edge of the blogging movement, which I kind of view as the godfather of independent journalism. Can you take us back to the moment when blogs started becoming a thing and what you think the legacy of that is today?
Well, it was a great time for those of us who were doing it. I think many of us came off of forums. I mean, you remember, the Usenet and, various ones that we were all sort of talking about. And politics were very exciting during that period. It was really during the run up to the Iraq War, the post 9/11 period, and the right had been really dominating the space. They had what they called war bloggers, and it was that they were, getting a lot of attention and were sort of, creating the form. And so those of us who were not on the right and who were, generally opposed to the war or at least skeptical, started writing and getting into this. And of course, the technology suddenly appeared where you had Blogger and various other platforms that showed up that allowed this to happen. And along with comment sections, which were also new with newspapers and magazines and others. And so, there was just this sudden burst of participation by, average citizens and political junkies and people who just were watching what was going on and were able to participate with other people. And so at the time, the blogosphere, and I don't know who coined that phrase, but it caught on very quickly. Those of us who sort of started blogs early, I started in 2002. So I've been at this for a very long time. And, writing daily, it's been quite a grind, let me just tell you. But nonetheless, there's been a lot happening in those 22 years. So, 24 years now, or 22, whatever. There's been a lot happening. So, we all started writing together, and it became kind of a community. And the form of blogging was different than any other kind of writing about current events or anything like that, although people were blogging about cooking and pets and everything else. But the form of it was a little bit different, the way the platforms were set up. And it was the participation that made the difference. Suddenly you had communities building around blogs building communities together. And in politics, it formed a kind of an activism hub where people were we started raising money, we started endorsing candidates, we started doing a lot of things. And at the same time, you had people doing independent journalism, which you referred to. And that, I think, started this, we still blog today. People call it Substack now, right. But it's essentially the same concept, which individuals and groups getting together, putting together, written and now, of course, video, commentary and journalism, and they're putting it together. And so we started doing that, and it just sort of burst. And by the 2004 election, it was just crazy. I mean, they were inviting us to conventions. We were speaking. We started our own conventions. We got profiles in the New York Times. I mean, it was crazy. But I think it did sort of introduce this new idea that journalism and commentary were not confined to experts and people who were necessarily paid or had been, trained in this particular thing. And for democracy, that should be a really good thing. And I think it did add a level of participation among citizens and voters and others with interests that, wherever it took them to actually start participating. So, here we are today. It's been a couple of decades, but I think, it's matured into what you guys are doing. I mean, you're an online group and, making a difference and doing a lot of participation and actually leadership. And that's, I think, what we were sort of aiming for without knowing at the time.
Yeah. And I remember a couple decades ago, there was a fair amount of tension between the blogosphere and mainstream media. And now with the rise of independent journalism on Substack, on YouTube, now you see a lot of mainstream journalism figures that have moved over here, like Don Lemon and Terry Moran and Andrew McFarlane. And they're finding a home in independent journalism, which would have been really unthinkable, back when you started. What do you make of all this?
Well, I think that's amazing. And it's also kind of thrilling because for one thing, look at what's happening to the mainstream media. I mean, where it isn't being completely dominated by, one political faction on the right, you have mainstream media struggling, mightily. You have local journalism struggling mightily to even, stay afloat. And so having independent journalists like the ones you mentioned and plenty of others who have now moved over into, the newsletter world or the Substack world or groups like yours, where they're working together and finding an ability to finance journalism at all. I mean, any kind of journalism, because this is becoming a real crisis. Without it, democracy just doesn't function. And you have to have, and it can't be dominated just by oligarchs and ideologues. I mean, it has to have some semblance of relation to actual people and voters and their concerns. So I think it's a great thing, and I'm actually really excited to see where this is going to go, because I think this is actually just the beginning. I think what you're seeing is a total transformation of the journalism sphere, which a lot of it's brought on by the internet. I mean, let's face facts. I mean, until the internet came along, this wouldn't have been possible. It's a very, easy entry to journalism and to reporting and commentary and whatever, with some very smart people doing it. That's an amazing benefit, I think, to democracy. And it's one of the things where people are very, very concerned about things that are happening, like with, with the Ellisons buying up CBS and now probably doing the same thing to CNN that they're doing to CBS, and seeing the way that Fox News dominates the Republican Party and all of that. Well, I mean, that is very scary, and they're, incredibly influential. But on the other hand, there's this, and I think it's more powerful, I think, than people realize. I think this may be where the real power will lie as we're going forward. I sound a little Pollyannish there, but I actually think it's true. Well, having watched this thing, participated in it from the very beginning, I can just see how the actual foundation of this, of the way that people think about journalism and news, I think that it has changed, and I think it's evolved into something that I think is going to be able to fill that gap. How it fills it, I don't know, we'll see. But for the moment, I think it's actually a very good sign.
Heather, Donald Trump has once again endorsed Hungarian President Viktor Orban for president. He's facing a re-election fight over there. And you wrote a really fascinating piece for Salon about how Orban is really the model for Trump in terms of how he handles the media. Can you talk with us about that? Because it feels like this is such a crucial part of where we are today and how Donald Trump is being covered by corporate media outlets. And yet this is a story that we don't talk very much about.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you bring that up in light of the conversation that we just had, because I think there's a relationship there. What Orban did in Hungary, and he had it's a very interesting parallel to Trump. He actually won, one term, and then he was perceived to be a bit of a failure, and he lost, and then he came back, and he came back with a much stronger plan on how to, dominate the Hungarian government and politics there. And one of the main things he did, he took over, he heavily influenced academia. He heavily influenced, the institutions around the country, and I think we can see the parallel there here. And then also the media. And what he did wasn't the idea being that you didn't do this new form of kind of, modern fascism or soft fascism, the way that, there weren't going to be people marching in the streets or, men in uniform beating up people on street corners, although we've decided that that's a good way to do things too. They thought, and they were right, that the way to do it was sort of through this sort of taking over of these institutions in subtler ways. So society carried on quite normally in Hungary. There weren't, heavy protests. There wasn't a lot of upheaval. Frankly, it just sort of happened very slowly and quietly. They took over those institutions, and basically now they run generally as mouthpieces for the Orban government. Now, I've been following this story for quite a while, because it's really interesting. Even before Trump and I don't even know if Trump consciously, does he actually know anything about this? I don't know. I mean, he's kind of vague on any kind of detail, but his people do. And the reason that we know this is because CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee that's been around for decades and decades, there were people among that crowd who saw what Orban was doing and saw it as this model. And they started going over there. They studied it. They had CPAC meetings there. Tucker Carlson went there and spent all this time in Hungary. So, I mean, it's not a hidden thing that this is a model. They're being pretty open about it. The thing is that in the piece that you're referring to, I think, I sort of looked at that, and you can see all the parallels and what they're doing and how that really tracks. On the other hand, the United States of America is not Hungary. And we are a much, much more diverse country. We have a much bigger sort of, breadth of ideology. Our institutions are stronger. So I'm skeptical that this thing will work. And I kind of think that that's one of the reasons why they have taken that extra step to send in ICE, for instance, to do this kind of thuggery that we're seeing. Because a lot of the rest of this isn't really working, or it hasn't worked yet for them. And they're very anxious to get this completed while they still have Donald Trump in office. Not that, God knows, Orban is up for election. We don't know if he'll win. He does have a pretty strong opponent this time. I think his name is Peter Magyar. And we'll see. It's possible that they have created some alternative journalism in Hungary, which is interesting. Leading me back to our earlier conversation. This is one of the strengths that will resist that, is the fact that, he can take over CNN, he can take over CBS. These are all crushing blows. I'm not suggesting it isn't. Certainly the fact that journalism is in financial crisis is a very, very big problem, but there's us. And I think that it's after 20 years of this has developed into an institution of its own, the idea of independent journalism. And I think that is, things like No Kings, for instance, could never happen if this didn't exist, right? That and those kind of protests and the way that people resist and are using these platforms in places like Minneapolis, that's the strength that we have here. And it's pretty new, and we don't actually know, how strong it is, but I'm very optimistic that this is going to be something that will resist this particular approach of Viktor Orban style government, and maybe even more, overt kind of fascist government. I think that this is a big strength, and so I'm hopeful.
Before we let you go, I do want to talk with you a little bit about how the mainstream media approaches political coverage. And you have written a lot about this. I remember there's this one piece when you were talking about how the media treated Hillary Clinton, like during the 2016 campaign. And you wrote, the fact that the press regularly and tirelessly slags Clinton for her failures in the 2016 campaign, but have still completely failed to acknowledge their own. That to me really sums things up. And I know everyone is sick of reliving 2016, but Donald Trump is president again. So we are in the process.
Yeah, whether we like it or not.
Right. We are not past this moment as much as we might have thought we might have been in 2021, for instance, when Joe Biden was inaugurated. But the New York Times and other mainstream outlets do take a very different approach to how they frame what Donald Trump does versus other politicians, not just Hillary Clinton, but that was very striking. Do you feel like there are media outlets that have learned from some of these mistakes, or is there still this lack of self-reflection from the legacy media and how they cover politics?
Well, it's a super interesting question, because over the course, being the kind of close observer that I am, I write every single day and have for over 20 years. And so I read everything and I watch everything. And you could call me obsessive if you want, because that would be fine. And certainly I've been a critic of the media over the years, and I think for good reason. I mean, but I have to say that from the time that I started doing this back in the early 2000s, and going through, and I was a heavy critic of the media during that period. I mean, heavy critic, and that was coming off of the Clinton years and the 2000 election, and all of the kind of things that I just saw as being, we have a very, very dysfunctional press that is actually, causing us tremendous amounts of danger in our system. And of course, over the course of that, and watching what happened during the Bush years and then the Obama years, and then coming up to that 2016 election, where it was just obvious that the press, I had seen some movement toward, a little bit of self-reflection and understanding as they came out. The Bush years at the end of it were, very discombobulating to everyone. I mean, you had the financial crisis, you had the failure of the Iraq war. I mean, everything just seemed like, what we thought was real, what we thought was happening was not really happening. And it was a very, very, I think, crisis, period. And then along comes Donald Trump up against Hillary Clinton, who had been the press's, I mean, she had long been their target, rightly or wrongly, however you feel about Hillary Clinton. I think she suffered from tremendously unfair press over her entire career, and especially in 2016. And along comes Donald Trump, this new, toy, this shiny object over here, who was providing a lot of entertainment, a lot of clicks, a lot of readership. People were very interested and excited in politics. And I just, I found it just surprising how easily they fell back into their old ways. That this habit of going back, it was just like it was almost just a muscle memory that they had. And it wasn't just about her. It was going back to the way that they sort of saw the Republicans versus the Democrats, and how, there was the man party and the woman party, and all this crazy stuff that had just been around for a long time. So that was a very, very difficult period to watch. And when Trump came in, the amount of effort that the press spent trying to, they went out into the field to seek out Trump voters, to tell me what you think. What do you think? And it was, an extremely close election. He won by the Electoral College and didn't win the popular vote. And so this kind of rapt attention at what they saw as sort of exotics, which I think were the Trump people. And that reminded me of what I had originally thought about the specifically the political press. During the Clinton years, there had been this idea that, they were going to protect the Capitol and protect the government from Bill Clinton and his predations. And they were very, 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 very hard on him. Sometimes rightly and sometimes wrongly, but they were hard on Clinton. Sally Quinn, who was the sort of matriarch of the Washington Post, wrote a very famous piece about how, perhaps the country doesn't see it, but we have a little village here in Washington, D.C., and we do not like to see it sullied by the likes of the Clintons. And so I sort of coined this phrase that this political press corps was the village. And basically they saw themselves as somehow protecting the country from the depredations of, the Clintons or whomever they had decided. And they took on this protector role. And, it was ridiculous. I mean, the idea that they knew better than the people. And again, here comes the blogosphere and independent media and all that, suddenly threatening the village, because these were actual people from, I'm from Los Angeles. There are people from Nebraska. There are bloggers from, small towns in Illinois. I mean, this is just, there's no barrier to that. You don't have to be part of the village or part of the inside club. And you still see vestiges of it when you read, the morning playbook, or, Punchbowl News, or some of those things. We're talking about all the parties that they go to and doing all this stuff. And so, I think that what happens there is that the press operates as in a very insular fashion. And you'll often see this. I think we saw it with Biden with the Afghanistan withdrawal. You saw what happened to him, who was basically following through on promises that presidents had been making for years, including Obama and Trump. And he went ahead and followed through on that. And because it was messy and chaotic, not unexpected in my view, they absolutely went after him. And it was like a reflex. And I saw it and I went, okay, it's still there. It's still underneath there, And as independent journalists, as independent commenters, I think we have to always be on guard against it. I mean, I think the New York Times is great. I'm pained at what's happened to the Washington Post. I depend on all these news organizations. They do great reporting. Even, the Wall Street Journal, what's going on there? I mean, they're doing great journalism. Opinion page, but they are doing great journalism in this second Trump term, especially. And so I'm all for it, and I wish them well, and I wish them success, because we need it. But at the same time, I do consider it our job as people who have platforms, to consistently be skeptical and critical and keep the pressure on. And I think it helps that we do that. I think it does help. I think they hear it. I think they're part of it now. It's like you say, people like Lemon and McFarland and others are now doing independent journalism, and that helps to kind of break down these barriers. And so I think that we have a job to do, and especially now, because what's happening now is that we're being inundated with propaganda and lies, and we've got to, from every direction, have to be doing everything we can to make sure that does not go unanswered.
Heather, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate the discussion.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you all for joining us today for our panel on the future of independent journalism. Please be sure to share your thoughts with us in the comments, and make sure to join me every week for First Draft, where I talk with journalists at 11 a.m. Eastern